Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Saba, and I will be your MC for tonight. I would like to begin by respectfully acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the traditional and unceded territory of Coast Salish peoples, specifically the Kwantlen, Katsi, Semiahmoo, and the Tawasin First Nations. We recognize that we are uninvited guests, and our acknowledgement of the land is our declaration of our collective responsibility to this place and its peoples, histories, rights, and presence. Lastly, we also recognize the adverse impacts of colonialism and the ongoing colonial practices which continue to harm Indigenous peoples and communities today. We are honored to have everyone join us today for the first event of Palestine Days. Palestine Days at SFU is a 3-day event that seeks to explore the history, politics, culture, and liberation of Palestine. It is also the first major event on Palestine in a very long time. It is community-led, collaborative, and cross-campus in Vancouver, Burnaby, and Surrey. The events feature incredible filmmakers, journalists, activists, and scholars, most of whom are Palestinians. Today's event, A Sky with No Stars, discusses Palestinian leadership and resistance under the Mandate. The birth of the British Mandate saw the emergence of Palestine's urban notables as the representatives of Palestine and the leaders of the Palestinian national movement. The Nakba, which resulted in the ethnic cleansing of 750,000 Palestinians from their homeland, brought the era of notables to a decisive end. Separated from their property and dislodged from their possessions of power, the notables' unceremonious fall from grace was punctuated by an almost universal charge of incompetence. In the court of Palestinian public opinion, as well as within the passages of history, Palestine's urban notables have been indicted for the crime of losing Palestine. Hosted by Bassam Abu Nadi, a Palestinian educator and researcher, this lecture addresses how it came to be that a social class which rose to such great heights in the Ottoman era came to perform so poorly on the biggest stage in Palestine's anti-colonial fight for survival. But before we begin our lecture, I would like to invite Elder Margaret George for an Indigenous welcome and reminder. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm also a visitor to this territory. I'm from the Tsleil-Waututh Nation in North Vancouver, and I always recognize the nations in our territory, which is Coquitlam, Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. I just had an elder's moment at that time. Thank you for inviting me to your event. It's been really exciting. I've been with SFU for a number of years, like going on 22 years in September as the elder in residence. And when I first started there, I had no idea what I was going to be doing with the students or with faculty or even with the president. So it's been a really very educational experience for me to be out and about with different people from different borders, from different cultures, from different lifestyles. And it's an honor to be here. A quick prayer and we'll get this event going. Great Spirit, thank you for bringing us together. Just guide each and every one of us. Take care of our families while we're away from home, especially the young ones. I ask Great Spirit to always remind us that we are the leaders and the mentors of those who follow us, those who witness what we do and what we say. I ask Great Spirit a very special blessing on each and every one here and your families and friends, all my relations, and thank you again.
Thank you, Elder Margaret, for your reminder. As many of you know, this event is hosted by the Center for Comparative Muslim Studies at SFU, also known as CCMS. I will pass it over to Dr. Adil Iskander, the interim director of the center, to share a few words.
Thank you so much. First and foremost, I wanted to thank you, Elder Margaret, for being here, for anointing us with your presence and with your words. I know that you are a guest on this nation, but as settlers here, we appreciate the constant reminder of the historical and present injustices that we are actively participating in through the erasure and effacement of these lands and their peoples. So I thank you for being here, and I thank you for always being a reminder for us as an SFU community, but also here at Kwantlen. So thank you for coming. I wanted to say first and foremost that it's a pleasure and a delight for me to be here on various levels. It is not often that we have cross-campus collaborations, but also across universities. So to be here at KPU is a reminder that our community traverses and transgresses boundaries, that when we think about decolonization, whether it's of these lands or Palestine, we are thinking beyond these artificial, fictitious, politicized borders. We belong both here and everywhere. We are all part of the same sort of collective endeavor to change our circumstances. So I want to thank you all for traversing these borders. If you've traveled far to get here or you are living here, you are part and parcel of that journey. And to be here alone is an indication that the commitment to decolonization and challenging settler colonialism in Palestine and here is something that matters to you. I know that this is not, it's a regular weekday, it's in the evening, you probably had other things that you would have planned to do, but you thought this was important, and I appreciate that you did that. Just saying that Palestine Days at SFU is entirely conceived and put together by members of the community. And I say that meaning members of entrenched communities that are part and parcel of the struggle to decolonize Palestine and the land on which we are. It is no small measure that one of the members of our team at the Center for Comparative Muslim Studies, Amal Abdullah, who rarely tries to take credit, but I will give her credit now and later. This is essentially her brainchild. She was like, if this is gonna be our swan song, both Amal and I will be not out of a job, but out of our current positions in a month and a half or so. And with that, we're like, wait a minute, how do we end on an important note? And there's no more important note than reminding people of not only the classic injustice, but the ragingly obvious sin committed against Palestinians and Palestine, something that we turn away from until it stares us in the face in the news. The recent murder of Shireen Abu Akleh, the Palestinian journalist, a few weeks ago, I feel like it's been a few weeks, is still a constant reminder that not only is Palestine being constantly erased, but even those who endeavor to tell the story of Palestine, who are there to confront the realities of apartheid and displacement and dehumanization, are themselves the victims of this incredible machine of violence. Another constant reminder that nothing protects us or them from these situations. She was a card-carrying U.S. citizen. So even that passport that people presumably try to acquire to protect themselves from dehumanization was not protection for Palestinians. So with that being said, I do want to say that we are lucky to have Bassem with us today. I haven't had the opportunity to meet Bassem personally, but I look forward to his thoughts and his reflections. I say this because from time immemorial, when academics are not around, in fact, I say that as an academic, the hard work of doing public intellectual work and actual organic history does not start or end at the academy. Universities and university professors like myself, we do not hold a monopoly on knowledge production. Quite the contrary. I would say that community members, individuals who are at the forefront of injustices and those who carry on that injustice, that burden of injustice, because they are the sons and daughters of those who have been uprooted, they're the ones doing that hard work. And Bassem is one of many remarkable Palestinians who have taken it upon themselves to do the hard work of trying to cover and uncover, revise and revisit the history of Palestine and Palestinians so that the revisionism begins. And I want to turn to someone that I respect tremendously, a Palestinian intellectual, Edward Said. Many of you might know who he is. And one of the things that he said, and this is a direct quote from Said, "My argument is that history is made by men and women, just as it can also be unmade and rewritten, always with various silences and elisions, always with shapes imposed and disfigurements tolerated." So this is a way in which Edward Said implores us of the important work of doing this history ourselves. For Palestinians, we're talking about a land in which 400 villages have been completely uprooted, erased, literally disfigured beyond recognition. And yet, who's doing this hard work? The people of Palestine in those villages. Every little village, irrespective of whether it exists on land, if you can look it up on Google Earth, or if it exists in the form of Palestinian diasporas around the world, they are doing the hard work of revisiting, revising, and rewriting their land. They are rewriting their stories, they're telling their oral histories. In fact, every village has a historian, and those historians have assembled over decades a narrative that tells the story of their land, including blueprints of maps from memory. This is not a small endeavor. If you're interested in looking at this remarkable project, there's a scholar called Rochelle Davis. She's collected for a huge amount of material on those original manuscripts produced by organic historians. Today, we are in the presence of a lot of organic historians. In fact, what we're doing today is precisely that, organic history. And so we're lucky to have Bassem with us. I look forward to hearing his remarks and for his sort of breakthrough endeavors in exploring what it meant to be Palestinian under the mandate at a very, very critical juncture in the life and history of Palestine. Thank you so much for being here. I hope that you will continue to follow the center's work, whether it's today, tomorrow, or the day after. We have a remarkable program. Please join us, and thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Adil. In collaboration with CCMS, the event is also hosted by the Caucus, which is a student-led organization that aims to dismantle harmful narratives within institutions. I'll pass it over to Parsa to share the work of the Caucus and the goals of the organization.
Hi, everyone. This is pretty off the cuff, so bear with me. The Caucus, Saba and I started thinking about the many problems we had encountering problematic syllabi in our classrooms, the many criticisms that were not made in the classroom, the difficult encounters we had in the classroom and within the academy in not being alienated from the material and the subjects in which we were studying and which we were often the subjects of study. And it was that kind of space that we straddled throughout this entire time, both being the subjects of study and objects of study, that we came to feel that something needed to be done, that we needed to find organization, community, grounded learning outside the spaces that were, though, Adele talks about not having a monopoly over knowledge production, certainly when it comes to the question of legitimacy, have taken a monopolistic stance, obviously because of various social institutions and relations. So for us, this entire process led to the creation of multiple projects among the student community. And beyond the student community as well, we have a rather flexible term, flexible understanding of what is being a student. It is in fact being a learner, as we understand it. And that involves not being alienated from what you study and from who you are when you study it. It's about understanding the totality of the pedagogical experience while you're engaging in it. And so we created multiple projects, some of them archived because, limited resources, it's a bunch of students. We don't have that much money, we don't have the time. during the pandemic, a lot of people facing many different obstacles. A lot of them related to, various social measures that weren't taken for a very long time, and some of them related to interpersonal encounters. We have a project currently, Muslim Studies, run by Saba, actually, has done honestly, everybody in the project have done such a great job. It's in collaboration with CCMS. And we've had multiple events thus far, and they've all been an incredible success, especially bringing the community together. We've also had Learning Palestine, previously labeled Free Palestine Project. We organized Palestine Action Week on the week of October 4th, 2021. We hope to continue the success and make it an annual thing. Make sure that there's an on-campus presence where Palestinian voices the idea of Palestine as a national liberation movement and a people who are struggling for their liberation is preserved, and it's not reduced to a conflict or a struggle between two equal parties. And these explorations come from dealing with that question of alienation. And we have many other projects as well. And most of them are, again, about engaging and re-engaging with the community at every juncture of the pedagogical methods we employ daily. We take what we can get from the academy, and there certainly are things that are valuable provided for by the academy, but we certainly try to understand what are the shortcomings, and a lot of times they're self-evident, and we return to the community, and we try to make sure that the students get off the campus and onto the streets, because that's where real learning happens. I'm not going to say much more. If you want further information about the caucus, our activities, if you want to start a project or join a project, if you want to participate in the community at large, you can reach out to one of our many members sitting among you. That's it from me. I'd like to thank everybody, for being here.
Thank you, Parsa, and again, thank you all for your introductions. Lastly, I would like to introduce you all to our amazing speaker for today's event, Bassam. So Bassam is an educator, researcher, and community activist with over 7 years of experience creating and delivering learning content. He's the director of Reclaim, a grassroots organization that works with schools, school districts, post-secondary institutions, and student groups to address and combat manifestations of Islamophobia and anti-Muslim bigotry at the curricular and pedagogical levels. He has a BA in political science from SFU and completed his MEd at UBC in 2017, where he specialized in the impact of globalization on education reforms in the Middle East. He is also the host of the podcast Preoccupation, a not-so-brief history of Palestine, which takes a deep look into the social, economic, and political histories of Palestine and the post-Ottoman Mashriq as a whole. He is the son of Palestinian parents and a father to Palestinian children. Please join me in welcoming Bassam.
Good, you're my sound check today. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulullah. Thank you for the wonderful introduction and for the kind words, for the multiple levels of organization that go into this. Thank you for the great people working at the caucus. Thank you for CCMS for working with. I have to be so careful when I say CCMS because every time I say it, I keep accidentally saying CSIS. I recommend a name change. So thank you, CCMS, not CSIS. Although let's be honest, there might be one or two of them here too, but could welcome them. When I began speaking with Emel and Saba about this event, I said, what do you guys want me to talk about? And they said, well, nothing too niche because the audience has various levels of literacy in the subject and we don't want to alienate anyone. And slowly I put this presentation together and it has evolved into what is honestly the most niche presentation I have ever put together in my life. But I, for a living, teach children complicated things. And so I'm always working on taking things that are relatively complicated and making them digestible for an audience that is, on a daily basis, 12 years old. The reality is that when you're dealing with content related to Palestine, that's what you have to do all the time. And the reason why I say that is because Palestine's story is not easy to tell. The moment that you divert from the beaten path of the conflict with the Zionist movement, Palestine's story becomes very challenging to share. And there's a very good reason for that actually Adil sort of touched on when speaking. As a stateless people, Palestinians do not have the state resources that other national movements which achieve their national liberation get to rely on. We don't have a standardized education system that all Palestinians around the world are plugged into. We don't have museums that are sponsored with the backing of a state. We don't have, at least not a state of our own. We don't have a long-established official historiography. We don't have archives. We don't have all of these things that usually come with a state that allow for a streamlined, simple narrative. Only a state could take something as convoluted as the French Revolution and bottle it into a moment. We don't have that luxury. And so when telling the story of anything related to Palestine, it requires a certain level of simplification. I kind of joked about it leading into this, but it's not something that I take lightly. In the content that I address in my podcast, I do try to take a pretty complicated story with a lot of moving parts that deals with a very clumsy, a very difficult, and an involuntary transition from empire to nation state, and put it in a story that is digestible for an audience that may not have any familiarity with the subject matter. Now, in the story of Palestine, there are a few motifs that continuously emerge. And one of the things that you will find, irrespective of which rendition of the Palestinian story that you're exposed to, is a pretty consistent set of antagonists. One being the British imperial project, the arch nemesis being the Zionist movement, and the third, the one that I will be dealing with in this talk, is the Palestinian leadership itself. The Palestinian leadership of the Mandate era is, whether you are looking at Palestinian sources, Palestinian historians, or the general scholarship interested in the subject, the Palestinian leadership is generally portrayed as this sort of fumbling, petty, cliquish, clannish group of buffoons who, at best, squandered the opportunity to save Palestine, and at worst, sold it. Now, in the interest of time, I can come back to this if you guys would like, but these are just some snippets of historians and British officials and different people commenting on what is the sheer incompetence of the Palestinian leadership. And the fact of the matter is that I don't actually dispute the allegations. The reality is that the Palestinian leadership did, in fact, fail to confront, on some level, complied with the British imperial project. The Palestinian leadership failed to confront the Zionist movement when confronting the Zionist movement would have been possible. The Palestinian leadership, and this is directly related to the other two failures, they failed to overcome the urban and rural divide that characterized the Mandate era of Palestinian life. Someone might look at this and say, are we judging the Palestinian leadership for having failed to predict the future. But I think that many were indicting the Palestinian leadership of failing to understand the present. And the problem that I have in this whole characterization of the Palestinian leadership, this whole overarching theme of incompetence, comes down to two problems. One is that there's, generally speaking, a lack of explanation regarding their incompetence. It almost seems like their incompetence is taken for granted, as if this is simply what Palestinian leadership is supposed to look like. And this draws from Orientalist tropes about what indigenous leadership looks like in general. So the idea is, when you read this in the work of history, you get a sense that the author is implying, well, what more did you expect? Right? Of course they were like this. That's one problem. And the other problem, and it's small, but it's serious, it's that I don't buy it for a second. I'm just not convinced. When you dive into the Ottoman era of Palestine, what you find are notable families who punch way above their weight class, who do so much, who are in so many ways so extraordinary that for me as the reader, it leaves me with questions, not answers. How is it that, and you might not be able to read this, so I'll just read it for you. How is it that the urban notables who navigated the Ottoman era so successfully failed so spectacularly as national leaders? Why did the Palestinian elite not subvert or launch a revolt against the British occupation? Why did they continue petitioning the British instead of fighting them? And just to summarize this here, why were they not able to overcome the urban-rural divide? Why is it that after the martyrdom of Izz-ad-Din al-Qassam, that there was no Palestinian notable who was able to rise to the occasion and take that national momentum and lead a successful national movement? One of the historians that really goes very hard on the Palestinian notables is Matthew Hughes. He wrote The Pacification of Palestine, a British pacification of Palestine. And one of the things that he kind of asks, he doesn't ask it rather, he demands it again and again, or he states it again and again. There was no Palestinian Mao or Ho Chi Minh or Che Guevara. And what I want to know is why? And so the framework that I have used in order to answer this is, first, what I'll be doing here is I need to explore who the Palestinian notables were and how did they come to power? What was their relationship to the rural population? And why were they poorly suited for a national struggle? And if so, why? Now, it turns out, and this is my most cherished goal, is to share with the audience a Palestine that was an organic part of the Ottoman and later the post-Ottoman Mashriq. I try to do this in my podcast, and I'll try to do this here today. So many of the things that I'm going to describe when I talk about the notables of Palestine also apply to notables outside of Palestine. The leadership structures in the post-Ottoman Mashriq were very consistent in what is modern-day Syria, Iraq, and elsewhere. Many explorations of the Palestinian notables really kind of reduce the conversation to one about race. And when I say race, I mean a reduction of a comparison between collectivist and individualist societies, and basically try to reduce the problems that the Palestinian notables had to one of family obligations versus national struggle. And most of this is, generally speaking, nonsense. And this is why we require a new approach. The problem with an approach that rests on class as its primary underpinning is that there are a lot of exceptions to that in the Palestinian leadership. To To summarize here, the approach that I've chosen to take is an approach that explores Palestinian leadership, and in fact, the post-Ottoman Mashriq leadership as learning communities. A group that took part in a common and distinct formal and informal learning journey. Now, the reason that I've done that is because the 19th century Ottoman Empire was a place of rapid and drastic change. And the primary vehicle to take the Ottoman subject and transform him into an Ottoman citizen, the primary vehicle for that transformation was education. Education is the state's attempt to do with policy that which it does not want to leave to chance. I graduated from high school in 2005. That dates me a little bit for some of you, and for some of you, maybe that is a not so distant memory. I remember Zidane's headbutt live. Some of you only watched it on YouTube. So in 2005, the big push in high schools was trades. So the state would send to us one of its henchmen to our career and education class, and they would convince us to register into a trades program at BCIT or something like that. So the state could have just left that to chance. Maybe some of us would register in trades programs and some of us wouldn't. But education is the state's attempt to stack the deck in their favor. I hope that's making sense. Now, why that's so important is because the late Ottoman Empire was a fanatically anti-colonial enterprise. And I mean that in that they were anti-European colonialism. They had their own colonial project that they were pursuing among their subject populations. But in terms of European colonialism, they were resisting it with the utmost force. And so one would expect that an anti-colonial project would have produced an education system that produced anti-colonial figures. And yet, we are left with this catastrophic failure that was the Palestinian leadership. And so it seems to me a sensible place to explore the education systems. There are some other interesting things about education that I think are worth mentioning. One moment. So much of education is beyond curriculum. If you think of your learning journey, the things that you remember from elementary school are probably not the things that you learned in the classroom. They are the games that you played, they are the people that you met, they are just little, as an elementary school teacher, it's remarkable how many of the traditions that I thought that me and my friends started clearly predated us and have continued. For example, I don't know if this still happens. Are you guys familiar with the game that when you tell someone like, hey, look in my pocket, and then you do this, and then you punch that person in the shoulder? So this is a game, it's not part of the curriculum, and yet it passes on from generation to generation. I'll use another, okay. I'm a product of the Surrey School District, and many people struggle with converting like units of measurement from imperial to metric. But every guy in Surrey knew that there were 28 grams in an ounce. So, and they didn't learn it in math. And if you really press them on it, they could tell you how much that ounce costs. So this is just one of those, these are things that you don't learn in the classroom. And so when I say that this is an exploration of learning communities, it's not just about what they learned in their schools. It's beyond that. So we begin with a conversation about the urban notables. You can all hear me okay? I feel like I'm yelling at you. Sorry? A little bit higher? Am I good? Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah. If I speak any louder, I'm going to pass out. So, okay. So, one could easily argue, see, I said earlier that the urban notables punched way above their weight class in the Ottoman era. the Palestinian urban notables. And when I say punched way above their weight class, you have to understand, Al-Quds was not, it was an important city, it was a holy city, but it was not Baghdad and it was not Damascus. So even though it was not those things, a family like the Husseinis, one of the premier notable families, managed to marry off one of their daughters to a grand wazir. This is not nothing. This is massive. The Khalidis ended up producing a scholar who was second to Shaykh al-Islam, which was the highest religious authority in the Ottoman Empire. So they were achieving posts that were not at all reflective of their small station. They navigated the Ottoman minefield so well, but one could simply argue that, yeah, but by the time the British came around, those guys died. So what's the point of comparing the Ottoman era Husseinis and Khalidis and Abu Sauds and Jarallas and Tuqans, and what's the point of comparing them with the ones in the Mandate era? And such a statement would miss a very important thing. The notable families were institutions, and they were vessels of institutional knowledge. They, in fact, manifested physical institutions like the Diwan, which was like a tribal meeting place. So the notable family itself took on a character that was more than the sum of its parts. Yes, they were an amalgamation of individuals, each of whom had agency and freedom and things like that. Yes, without a doubt. But the family itself also took on an identity of its own. The closest thing that I could compare it to in a Western context is a corporation. In the same way that Steve Jobs or Tim Cook or Bill Gates or whatever, that they are the CEOs or they are participants in the Apple or Microsoft enterprise, Apple itself has an identity that is separate from Steve Jobs and Tim Cook and these individuals. Some people have compared, and I think foolishly make the comparison between the notable families and political parties. And that's usually like American projection upon Palestinian notable politics. The reality is that the Palestinian notables produced political parties. They produced institutions, they produced businesses. So they were much more than just a group of individuals that were biologically related to each other. Their ultimate goal was the health, wealth, well-being of their members. The emergence of the Palestinian notables in the Ottoman era was from a few sources. To become a notable family was basically, number one, first and foremost, rooted in lineage, in noble lineage. And to put that even more clearly, if they were descendants of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, if they were descendants of the Prophet Muhammad, then they had a very good shot at being notables. Once they had that lineage, if they then chaired positions like the Imam of Masjid al-Aqsa or the Mufti of Al-Quds, or something like that, this increased their prestige. These were notables that were called the Ashraf, literally the nobility. The Effendis, mostly from Nablus, were merchants, who then also took on religious positions, and through their piety and prestige, they were able to acquire this status. And you had another category who I've heard some authors refer to as Aghas, who are basically descendants of Ottoman warriors, or descendants of people who marched with the army of Salah ad-Din. So this is how the notables emerged. And when the iron fist of modernity came smashing down on Palestine, the Palestinian notables they rolled with the punches very well. And they didn't have to. There was nothing inevitable about this, and yet they did. And so they transformed themselves. They reimagined themselves. They went from turban to tarboush. They went from clerics to bureaucrats. They, without turning this into a Tanzimat lecture, as Ottoman modernity rolled out, and the Sharia became a smaller and smaller part of life in Ottoman Palestine, the Ottoman notables also left their investment in the Sharia behind and invested in the Ottoman state. And so fewer and fewer of them were pursuing religious education, and more of them were pursuing a modern education. This will be what I spend most of my time speaking about. But this story will not make sense if we do not explore the devastation that fell upon the Palestinian peasants with this modernity. In order for the Ottoman state to expand, the Palestinian peasant had to be disarmed. Now, if you are surprised that the Palestinian peasants were armed in the first place, don't be, because this was their negotiating tool with the Palestinian notables. While the notables held prestige, honor, knowledge, and judicial positions, the peasants possessed what was the closest thing to a monopoly on violence. So if the notables did not treat the peasants very well, the peasants can burn their homes to the ground. And so all of the notable families, whether in Nablus or in Al-Quds or in Jaffa later, they all had relationships with basically private peasant militias. Well, with the disarmament of the peasant, that negotiating tool left. The next devastating change to peasant life was the privatization of land. If you want to just grab the scale of how devastating this was for the peasants, that land was privatized, understand these two things. Number one, land in the early Ottoman era was communally held, ard masha', held by a community. So a person could not say, this is my plot of land, like in the way that we would go to the city now and say, this is my little square. They would just say, this is the land of my tribe. The clumsy transfer of land from communally owned to privately held meant that by the end of the Ottoman era, 50% of privately held land in Palestine was the property of 250 families. So it's so difficult to imagine how they just woke up and suddenly did not own any of the land that they were on. Now, we can go in the Q&A of exactly how that happened, and whether it was by hook or by crook, it happened. And so what that left was a late Ottoman era, wherein two previously equal parties, peasant and urban notable, now were engaged in a relationship that was very much unequal. It was a patron-client relationship. To such an extent that the peasants, in order to escape conscription, would literally seek refuge, luju', with a notable family. They would seek the protection of a notable family in order to pay their, what was called a badal fee, like I will pay this so that this person does not have to go to the army. So they were very much at the mercy of the urban notables. This was the relationship that was characteristic of the very late Ottoman Empire. For the notables, all over the Mashriq, there were essentially two streams of education. How many of you have attended any other of the lectures that I've had the privilege of engaging in? Okay. So for some of you, this will be a partial review, but do not despair, I go into a lot more detail. So if you've driven a long way, you'll get your gas money's worth, and that's quite expensive, so that says a lot. The first of the two streams were the civil academies. So the Ottoman Empire created a series of institutions that the first thing that I have to say about them were for fee-paying students. So that should tell you something. In a society where most people were subsistence farmers, the people who could afford the fees to go to school were few and far between. But in any case, the civil academies were for fee-paying students, and what they were trained to do there were to be bureaucrats, civil servants at the service of the state. This was their job. The Mulkiye Academy of the Ottoman Empire, which was the sort of terminal destination of students of the civil education stream, it is now the Ankara Institute of Political Science. So it gives you an idea of what they were trying to produce. Their idea was to create an Ottoman identity around a shared experience and a shared understanding of what it meant to be an Ottoman subject. And I love this, this one memorandum from the Ottoman state. It says, quote, "It is His Imperial Majesty's wish that men of great firmness over religious faith and national zeal be trained to believe that their happiness is one with the eternal sublime state." So that gives you an idea. For the first time ever, really, they were being asked to imagine that they were members of a nation. And this was a new Ottoman concept. And that's really what the civil academies were trying to do. We're trying to build a national identity in an empire of supreme difference. The civil academy graduates, their job was to manage that difference. Specifically, to manage the expanding sovereignty of the state, to administer services which were previously held by non-state actors. Things like healthcare, things like water access, places of worship, all of these were built by awqaf, by private trusts. They were not built by the state, generally speaking. But now, with the advent of a modern nation-state project, this is exactly what these civil servants were being asked to manage. As far as their extracurricular learning was concerned, and this is very important in terms of understanding the learning journey of the Palestinian notables, but this is not exclusive to Palestinian notables. But anyway, from 1908 to 1914, the Palestinian notables did a really remarkable job of going from these family notables to parliamentarians. They represented places like Al-Quds and Nablus and Haifa. They represented them in the Ottoman parliament. And they brought forward very important votes, very important conversations that were that are not at all characteristic with the fumbling buffoons that we've been taught to believe were the Palestinian notables in the Mandate era. See, this is one of those things that are just so hard to reconcile. Now, there's a really, really important thing that needs to be mentioned at this point, and I just didn't know where else to fit it. Most of the Palestinian notables who attended the civil academies also at some point in their education, I don't want to say most, many, so many of them, also attended missionary schools. And so, and for that matter, many Christians and Jews also attended the civil academies. So there was a lot of overlap in Palestine, and for the first time, Muslims and Christians and Jews were sitting in the same learning environment. Just as an interesting anecdote, a group of Polish Jews actually moved to Istanbul to attend the learning academy there, Istanbul University, in 1906, 1907. One of them, David Grun, was a graduate of the Istanbul Civil Academy. He then moved to Palestine, became a very well-known Zionist, Hebraicized his name as David Ben-Gurion, graduate of the Istanbul Civil Academy. So for the first time ever, Palestinian, Muslim, Christian, and Jewish children are going to school together. And it was the civil academies that gave us what I refer to in my podcast as the Palestine frozen in time. There's this image of Palestine that many of us have of rolling citrus groves and tarbush wearing effendis kind of, gallivanting around Jerusalem and coffee shops and these ideas that we have of the kind of thing described in Michel Campos has a great book, Ottoman Brothers, and the diaries of Wasif Jawhariya, of Muslim, Christian, Jewish coexistence. I believe that that was a product of the education system. That was because that Muslim, Christian, and Jewish children were able to study together. Now, I have here, again, I'm a teacher by training, so I've put here important observation. Like if you were taking notes, which I'm not telling you that you need to do, I can send these slides out, but if you were taking notes, this would be something noteworthy that I would hope that you remember. The civil academies horizontally expanded social hierarchies in Palestine, creating a cross-sectarian elite and shuffling around the same elite families in a relatively minor game of winners and losers. Overall, however, the civil academies did not transform Palestine's urban peasant power dynamics. And they could not have transformed those dynamics because the peasants did not attend the civil academies. Because if they costed even 1 Turkish pound, it was too much. Any amount of money to educate your children was too much for most of the peasants. It was out of reach. Which brings us to the second stream of education that characterized the late Ottoman Mashriq, the military academies. I promised you that this would make sense. Is it making sense? Okay. It's hard to tell. All right. So the most important thing to say about the military academies, first and foremost, is that they were free. And the first military academy opened up in 1834. Look, in all of the things that I've read about the late Ottoman Empire, and all of the things that I've read about the late Ottoman Mashriq, there has been nothing that has captivated my imagination and that has formed an obsession of the last several years like these military academies. So I don't know if that's going to carry over, but I'm going to go into a bit of detail here. They began in 1834, and they began as, look, education is hard, and it's even harder when you've never had standardized education before. Okay, when you do not have teachers, you do not have an educated class, you do not have any of these things, where do you begin? And so, it was actually the brainchild of Namik Kemal, a great Ottoman diplomat, well accomplished, and this is just one of many feathers in his hat. Began this Ottoman military academy to try to improve the quality of the officer corps. Keep in mind, like 5 years before this, the Ottomans were routed by Muhammad Ali Pasha of Egypt, like one of their vassals. Like it was very embarrassing, a very embarrassing time. Also keep in mind that 10 years before this, the core of their army were the Janissaries, like a slave army, essentially. So the Ottomans did not have a modern army, but needed to create one. So they did what seemed to be the sensible thing, if you're looking for an immediate solution to a problem. They created a university. And were just hoping to draw from their existing officer corps and throw them into the university. These officers couldn't read. They couldn't write. They didn't know very, very basic things that were required to be a student in a modern school. It was a disaster. It did not go well. And it didn't go well for a long time. They started sending officers to France and Germany, also with very little fruit to show for it. And so, I mean, of course, something I hope is obvious to the audience, which is that you can't start that way. You need to start with children. But they have wars to fight now. They can't wait 30 years for an officer to be produced. And this is why things kind of headed in this direction for a very long time, until a colossal global event changed war forever. And that was the Franco-Prussian War. And up until that point, Bismarck's Prussia gave new meaning to the words war machine. Like they walked into this war and trampled France like they were a colony. It wasn't even close. The casualty rates were 10 to 1. And they deployed railroads like no one had ever seen. The Prussians had been analyzing the American Civil War and had seen the bloodbath that was. And so they had studied what war was going to look like. And so when it came time for them to march into France, they did, and they smashed France. And this was really important for the Ottoman Empire, who right now at this point had all French instructors in their military academies. And they realized, we've been drawing from the wrong camp. Not only that, but this Prussia, a year later, formed a German empire that was also not like anything the world had seen at the time. It was not a project around, it was not a national project around a king or a czar. It was forged out of blood and iron, where the citizen is a soldier and the soldier is the nation. And the Ottomans looked at that and said, we'd like to order that. That's what we want. And so when Sultan Abdul Hamid ascended to the throne in 1876, a few years later, the Ottomans reached out to the Germans and said, would you like to come, basically revolutionize our military academies? And at first the Germans said, we're not really interested. But some philosophical changes began in Germany, and the Ottomans were gifted with the arrival of Kolmar van der Goltz, forever known after that as Goltz Pasha. Van der Goltz was the author of the book A Nation in Arms. He was the architect of the German military education system. He was exactly the type of person that you'd want revolutionizing your education system. And it came at the perfect time because he had fallen out of favor with the German top brass for being too blunt. Now, one must question, what kind of asshole do you have to be too blunt in Germany, right? He was so direct that even the Germans said, this is too much. So he was exactly what the Ottomans needed, and Sultan Abdul Hamid hated him. They did not get along, and they never got along. But he helped create a full military education system, okay? From top to bottom, from bottom up. And basically what happened thereafter is that all around the empire, you had elementary schools. By the way, the civil education system mirrored this, where you had elementary schools where children would register for school when they were 5 or 6 or 7 years old. And in a very much merit-based education system, if the children were exceptional, they went to a regional high school in the regional capital. And if they were exceptional, they went to the elite military academy, the Harbiya Academy in Istanbul. And if they were the best of the best of the best of the best, they went to the Staff College. And these were merit-based institutions. They really were the best of the best. Through these military academies emerged a unique social class. Just imagine being a little boy from Baghdad or from Damascus, or not even from Dar'a, from some village somewhere, and you kiss your mother for what will be the last time in a very long time, and you get on a horse or a donkey or a camel, and then on a boat, and then maybe on a train, and you end off somewhere far from home. It is a formative experience. And a social class emerged from that. They were so feared by Sultan Abdul Hamid, and this is not a lecture about Sultan Abdul Hamid, but let me just stop and say that he's one of the most fascinating characters in Ottoman history. Just a very complex, he doesn't come off very good in this story, but he's a very complex, very fascinating character. He placed spies among the military academies because he suspected that one day they would try and overthrow him. They did, that happened, but he suspected it nonetheless, and he also aggravated the situation. As part of their extracurricular learning journey, for around the same years, that the Civil Academy graduates, not exactly the same years, but around the same years, that the Civil Academy graduates were getting their experience as parliamentarians, as national leaders, as community leaders. The military graduates were engaged in wall-to-wall counterinsurgencies. In the Christian parts of the Ottoman Empire, they were dealing with national insurgencies. In the predominantly Muslim parts of the empire, they were dealing with tribal insurrections. And if you know how to fight a counterinsurgency, you also know what a successful insurgency looks like. In fact, one of the graduates, Sa'id al-As, of Syrian origin, he wrote a manual on insurgencies and counterinsurgencies. I may have missed it, but because I went through the slides so quickly, but while they were learning all of these things, and they were learning intelligence gathering, winning over the hearts and minds of local populations, expanding local institutions for the purpose of winning over hearts and minds, divide and conquer, and of course, fear, intimidation, domination, subjugation. They were learning all of these things. While they were learning these lessons, the way that the Civil Academy graduates were expressing their knowledge was through petitions, protests, more bureaucratic expressions. Now, I do have to go back to this. In the Mandate era, the Civil Academy graduates continued using all of the things that they learned in the Ottoman era, except that they were robbed of their position as parliamentarians. So let me slow down and explain what I mean here. From 1918 to 1948, the Palestinians never achieved self-representation under the British. So the position that they had experienced in the Ottoman era as members of parliament, they never had a similar position as British subjects. But they continued to use all of the other tools that they had learned in the Ottoman era. And the most successful that they used very extensively in the Ottoman era, that they continued to use with the British, was the petition. Writing petitions to Al-Mandub al-Sami, to the High Commissioner. Writing petitions to the Prime Minister. Writing petitions to the League of Nations. And with hindsight, we can mock them a bit for this. And we could kind of ask, what were you thinking? Right? Like, why would you do this? But the reality is they weren't always unsuccessful. It was Civil Academy graduate petitions that allowed for Hajj Amin al-Husseini to become Grand Mufti. Because there was an election for who was going to be the Mufti of Jerusalem, and al-Hajj Amin lost. But it was the petitions of the notables of Jerusalem that propelled him to a victory that he did not earn. So sometimes they were successful in petitioning the British, but overwhelmingly, they failed in petitioning the British to overturn the Balfour Declaration, to deal more even-handedly between them and the Zionist movement. And so this is just something that I did not mention before that I feel like I had to. Well, the counter-example here with this military academy graduates was they learned all of these things. Intelligence gathering, domination, hearts and minds, divide and conquer, insurgencies and counterinsurgencies. Important observation. Military academies transformed power dynamics throughout the Ottoman universe, propelling men from humble origins into positions of immense power, such as the position of the mushir. The mushir was like they were the military governors. They were the senior most positions in among the officer corps in a particular region, and they were the rival to the wali of that province. So the wali of Damascus and the mushir of the 7th Army were rivals. And they were very much in equal standing. And what's remarkable about this is that the wali of Damascus would have been a notable, would have been someone of noble lineage. And the Mushir, in all likelihood, would have been someone who was born a peasant. And that was transformative. That's something the military academies accomplished. Now, here's another very important thing about the knowledge journey of the military academy graduates. They knew Palestine as a battlefield. The Battle of Nablus was one of the last battles in the First World War. Jerusalem saw significant fighting, so did Gaza, so did Bir al-Saba. Palestine was a battlefield in the First World War, and the military officers like Yassin al-Hashimi, Fawzi al-Qawaqji, Mustafa Kemal, they fought in Palestine. And this is not nothing. Like, you think if you're looking for anti-colonial figures to lead a national uprising of liberation, this is significant. In the Mandate era, the military academy graduates melted into newly emerging nation states. Now, I say here, for those of you who are old enough to remember, think the de-Baathification of Iraq. When Saddam's Iraq crumbled, the officers from Saddam's army melted into the Iraqi population. And this is essentially what happened on a much grander scale with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. They ended up forming this social class that was once an Ottoman social class, became a transnational social class with groups in different, now newly emerging nation states all over the Arab Middle East. And they were connected by this shared experience, by mutual respect, and in many ways, a deep-rooted sense of anti-colonialism. This was not universal. They didn't all have this, but it was a very common quality among the military graduates. Now, between the two groups, the Civil Academy graduates and the Military Academy graduates, who do you think would make better anti-colonial leaders in a national struggle for liberation? Hands up if you think it is the Civil Academy graduates. Hands up if you think the Military Academy graduates, those are the ones that you'd want to have on your side. Okay. I too believe that the Military Academy graduates would be the ones that I'd want in my camp if I was trying to lead a battle for liberation. What I'm going to share with you is what may be my first and potentially only unique contribution to the field of Palestinian history. I'm going to show you the high schools that were built in order to facilitate the recruitment of military officers in the Ottoman Empire. So I'm going to show you the year and the cities that all of the high schools were built in order to recruit peasants and Bedouins in order to join the military academies. And I want you to tell me what you notice. Just feel free to raise your hand when you notice it. Yep. No. I practice on you. You don't get this. Dosam and I work together. He's my sounding board at work. No. Don't cheat. Don't be shy. And honestly, it's okay if you get the wrong answer. Maybe you'll have a unique insight that is different from the insight that I had. There were no military academies in Palestine. And that is very closely related to another observation. You see, in the Mandate era, when these military officers bled into the local populations, dozens of military officers made Syria their home. And among them were Yusuf al-Azma, Muhammad Izz al-Din al-Halabi, Sa'id al-As, Fawzi al-Qawaqji. These all became very, very significant anti-colonial figures in the fight against French colonialism. In Iraq, over 300 officers returned home. I put home in air quotes Because when you went to school, yes, if you were born in Basra, and you went to school in Baghdad, and you went to an academy in Istanbul, and then you did your military service in Antakya, where is home? But many of them, when the empire collapsed, returned home. 300 returned to Iraq. And among them, Yasin al-Hashimi and his brother Taha, Ja'far al-Askari, and Nur al-Sa'id. Mustafa Kemal, who I did not include here, he took over 1,000 military officers with him and his Ottoman army, 15% of whom were of Arab origin in Mustafa Kemal's army. Even in Jordan, in Transjordan, in Amir Abdullah's Transjordan, one of the, sorry, I misspelled his name here, one of the highest ranking Arab officers ever, Ali al-Rikabi, who had the distinction of becoming Jordan's first prime minister and then Syria's third prime minister, but who also happened to be from Iraq. He was not from either of those countries. He made Jordan his home. And so did Ramadan Shallash. But there were no military officers in Mandate Palestine. In the entire era of Mandate Palestine, there is not one recorded permanent presence of a Maktabli, when I say Maktabli, I mean military academy graduate residing in Palestine in the Ottoman era. When we look at the Palestinian notables of the Ottoman era, they are all civil academy graduates. Every single one of them. As far as the peasant rebel leadership is concerned, Yusuf al-Durra, Arif Abdul Raziq, Abdul Rahim al-Hajj Muhammad, all the ones who led the revolt of 1936, for the most part, they had no formal education of any kind. Some of them, if they were fortunate, maybe their fathers were Islamic scholars and they were enrolled in the Kutab system so they could read and write, and some of them couldn't do that. There were no military graduates in Palestine, which leaves me with two massive questions. And this is the point where I want to take an intermission. When we come back, we're going to answer, inshallah, why Palestine had no military academies and why Mandate Palestine had no officers. Good time for a 5-minute break? Do we have, everyone's here? We're good? I'm going to start. Okay, khalas, you guys are here, you're listening, I'm going to start. So, when I stumbled along this, there are many questions that I had in the research that I've been doing. There are many questions that I've come across that I did not know the answer to. And it turns out, and if you try this, you'll discover the same thing. Many researchers and academics, even famous ones, will answer your emails if your question is thought-provoking enough. It turns out that they care a lot about the research that they do. And so oftentimes I'll be reading a book and I'll come across something that I found interesting, and so I'll just email the author. And more often than not, they will email me back. So one of the researchers who I met along this journey of creating the podcast and doing other things is a great researcher out of Australia named Marcelo Svarsky. And just a great human being. He's written some terrific books, After Israel and Co-Resistance. And it just explores Palestinian-Jewish relations and the way that they both resisted Zionism in the Ottoman and Mandate eras. Great research. So I asked him, Marcelo, why is it that Palestine had no military academies? And why were there no military officers in Palestine? To which he said, how do you know that they didn't have any military academies? So I shared some of my research with him, and he said, okay, I don't know, but why does that matter? I said, well, in analyzing the anti-colonial struggle of Palestinians, one would imagine that had they had military officers, it would have decisively changed the way that they were able to engage with the British Empire and with the Zionist movement. And he said, I have no idea. Thought had never crossed his mind. I just need to be very clear, because this is part of the story. I didn't realize that I had asked him something novel, because I'm an idiot and I'm always asking questions, right? I don't know everything, so I didn't realize that this was something unique. So he said, let me send this to Yuval Ben Basset. And Yuval Ben Basset is another amazing researcher, reading one of his books right now called Petitioning the Sultan. Just amazing. Amazing author, amazing researcher. And he said, I don't know. I didn't realize that they didn't have military academies. It could be for this, but his answer was very general. So he said, you should email Rashid Khalidi. I said, I'm going to email Rashid Khalidi. Like, I'm not his student. He doesn't know who I am. He said, no, just email him. You'll see what happens. So I emailed Rashid Khalidi, and he emailed me back. Now, Rashid Khalidi emailing me back felt like what normal people must feel when they meet celebrities. Because I did not think that I would end up in an email exchange with a guy whose name is all over my bookshelf. And so I sent him the question, and he said, and it was full of obsequious pandering. I love your books. Your work means so much to me. But I meant it, but really I also had this very pressing question. And he came back and said, interesting observation. You may be onto something, and I'm not quite sure why they had no military academies, and I don't know why there were no officers there either. And he said, you might want to email Ben Fortna. Ben Fortna is the author of Imperial Classroom. He is the world's foremost expert on Ottoman education. Okay, so at this point, there are maybe 20 people on Earth who might have the answer to this question. I've asked 4 or 5 of them. And I emailed Ben Fortna, and he says, I have no idea. I studied the civil academies. I never studied the military academies. In fact, one trend that you will find if you dive into Ottoman history and Ottoman historians is that most people study the military academies, study the civil academies and not the military academies. He said, who you need to speak with is Michael Provence. So I emailed Michael Provence, author of one of the best books I've ever read in my life, called The Last Ottoman Generation. This book just has no fat in it. Every single sentence is a sledgehammer. He just, in Arabic we'd say he has balagha. He's very concise in the way that he writes. Just can say so much with so few words. And I emailed him, and I posed the same questions to him, and he said, I was hoping someone would notice this, because I too noticed that there were no officers in Palestine in the 1920s and 30s. He said, but I don't have an answer to it. I don't know why they weren't there. I don't know how that happened. His work, his specialization was Syrian politics. So he focused, although The Last Ottoman Generation deals with the notables in general, and he's a specialist in Syrian history. And so I realized that there was a mystery to solve. And I set about solving it. And I actually have the answer. And here it is. So number one, I want you to keep in mind the Ottoman Empire did not design its institutions with the collapse of the empire in mind. It's not that Midhat Pasha and Namik Kemal and these guys were saying, listen, in 50 years, the Sykes-Picot Agreement is going to tear us apart, so we need to make sure. They didn't know what the borders of the post-Ottoman world was going to look like, because they were absolutely committed to making sure there was never a post-Ottoman world. Their focus was the survival of the Ottoman Empire by any means necessary. And so you need to keep that in mind. But with that in mind, understand that Palestine was divided into two, I don't really need this slide, I'm going to go over. Palestine was divided into 2 districts. The Palestine that we know, Palestine min al-Bahr ila al-Nahr, from the river to the sea, was divided into two Ottoman districts, the Wilaya of Beirut and the Mutasarrifat of Jerusalem. And so, I have a map for you. Put this in my pocket. You can see here, I'm told that I have a laser pointer. I do. So this is Palestine. And you could see here in the brown that this is the Wilaya of Beirut, and this is the Mutasarrifat of Al-Quds. With regard to the Wilaya of Beirut, military academies were only built in the regional capitals. They were not built in the Sanjak administrative areas. So what that means is that Beirut got a military academy, whereas Nablus, Haifa, Akka did not. That part was easy enough. In fact, through my email exchanges with Ben Fortnow, with Michael Provence, Rashid Khalidi, this kind of triangulated very quickly. This much was clear. So why not Al-Quds? I mean, I said that Jerusalem wasn't the most important city in the Mashriq, but it wasn't nothing. It wasn't a backwater. Why did Al-Quds not have a military academy? And this is the question that nobody really had the answer to. And I kind of had given up on finding the answer to it until I was reading a book on Ottoman military history, an oppressively expensive book, by the way. Some of these books are very steep. And I came across the strangest little anomaly, and that is that the Ottoman military did not, up until Safarbarlik, like up until the call to arms for the First World War, the Ottoman Empire did not ever engage in mass universal conscription. There were always some exceptions to conscription, always. Christians were not always conscripted. Imams were not conscripted, nor were their families. Certain people were just exempt. And part of that exemption were holy cities, including Mecca, Medina, and Baytul Maqdis. And not just the holy cities, but their surrounding areas. So that meant that Baytul Maqdis, wa aknaf Baytul Maqdis, Jerusalem and the areas surrounding Jerusalem were not deemed to be appropriate for military recruitment. And the military academies were, at their core, military recruitment centers. What that meant is that Palestine barreled into the Mandate era without any institutionalized knowledge of how to resist an occupation. So why were there no military officers in Palestine? This is a different question. See, we answered the question of why there were no military academies in Palestine. And what this means, you can see how these two things are related, right? It means that Palestine did not produce many, if any, indigenous officers. But it would be foolish to think, maybe not foolish, it would be a stretch to think not a single Palestinian ever went to any of the military academies. Because they could have gone another way. They could have gone to Damascus or to Beirut, and they would have just registered in the paperwork as a citizen of Damascus. But in my conversations with Michael Provence, we did discover that there were no Husseinis, Khalidis, Tuqans, Jaral, no Palestinian names. People know the names of Palestinian families, and they were not there. But we're not ruling it out. It is possible. It hasn't been found. Okay, so that means that they weren't producing a lot of indigenous officers. But why were there no officers in Palestine at all? You know the names that I mentioned to you earlier, all of these officers? They weren't necessarily from those countries. I mentioned to you, Mustafa Kemal, 15% of his officers were of Arab origin. Yassin al-Hashimi, before he went to Iraq, went to Syria. Right? Fawzi al-Qawaqji was from Tarablis in modern-day Lebanon. So the first thing that you have to keep in mind is that World War I was a meat grinder of unprecedented scale. So the possibility that a Palestinian homegrown military officer went to the battlefield and was chewed up and spit out in the Battle of Gallipoli is very possible. Right? Thousands of officers died. Right? If any of you attended my World War I talk, you'd remember I talked about 80,000 marched into the Russian winter with Enver Pasha, and 4,000 came back. Right? So the thousands of officers that must have died in that war is just unimaginable. So there's one explanation. Here's my attempt at an explanation. Palestine did not feature any viable project for the military officers. These military officers were not raised to take part in the social experiment. They were trained to take over it. If the Civil Academy graduates were managers of difference, the Military Academy graduates were to take that difference, encase it in gunpowder and brass, and fire it at the Sultan's enemies. They were not there to be managers of anything. They were there to lead the fight for the survival of the empire. And they, if they fought in the First World War, were at the prime of their life. Well, with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, what were the viable projects that were going around? Where was a military academy graduate going to realize his full potential? Well, for many of them, it was with Mustafa Kemal, right? Go march on with the Ottoman army and go fight for what was really then an Ottoman war until Mustafa Kemal turned it into a Turkish war. For some, Iraq looked like it had a lot of promise. And in fact, and we could answer it in the Q&A, of all of the Arab regions in the Mashriq, Iraq, more than any place, produced military graduates. And in fact, the military graduates just ended up taking over the country. They essentially were the counterbalance to Amir Faisal. They called them the Sada generation, 300 military officers. Palestine, between 1918 and 1920, was widely recognized as part of the southern Syria project. The people of Palestine, when asked by the King Crane Commission, what do you want? Said, we want to be with our brothers in Syria. This is who we are. This is something, by the way, that some Palestinian nationalists are uncomfortable with, which is silly. But anyways, this is the reality, that in 1920, that the Palestinians very much saw themselves as part of the greater Syria project. They had no love for Amir Faisal. That was a whole other issue. But they saw themselves as part of that project. And the officers who were being decommissioned from the Ottoman army also saw Palestine as part of the Syria project. Now, if you've been trained to lead and fight, are you going to make Jerusalem your home or Damascus? They went to Damascus. And so many of these officers made Damascus their home, and many of them went and propped up the Arab kingdom of Syria until the French crushed it. And from there, they dispersed once again, mostly to Iraq, some to Jordan. Some even went on Enver Pasha's failed mission to create a Central Asiatic Turkish project until the Red Army mowed them down. And so what does any of this mean? Like, why is this significant? Why have I dedicated such an unhealthy amount of time to this? The first thing is, those institutions that I told you about at the beginning of this talk, these notable families, the notable families of Palestine went for the last almost, 70 years, 7 or 8 decades of Ottoman history, without ever having contained any of that military knowledge. None of their family members, none of their neighbors had participated in that learning journey. It literally flew right over them in a sense, or walked around them, take whatever analogy you want. They did not absorb any of it. What I say here is that the Palestinian notables and rebel leadership did not possess the necessary institutionalized Ottoman-era knowledge to help launch a successful anti-colonial struggle. They had experience with petitions, protests, creating political organizations and parties. They did not have any experience leading an anti-colonial struggle. Neither the urban peasants, neither the rural peasants, nor the urban notables. The Palestinian leadership did not witness the social transformation that the military academies created in the rest of the Ottoman Mashriq. And this is very significant because it allowed the Palestinian notables to continue living in the fiction that they were better than the peasants, because they had never seen a peasant transform into a military leader, into a national figure. They had never witnessed it among their peasants. So they could continue believing that they were better than the rural peasants who sought refuge with them anyway. Everywhere else around them, in Syria, the military graduates and the lower urban notables and the Druze of Hawran were able to form a kind of agreement among equals, that they were on an equal playing field. The notables of Palestine could not bring themselves to believe that. And with some empathy, you have to say, how do you blame them? They had never witnessed it. They had never seen that transformation. When the Palestinians did fight, they had no access to that transnational social class that now dotted around them. Whereas Yassin al-Hashimi and his brother Taha were regularly going back and forth from Turkey to Syria, meeting with their old classmates, speaking 4 different languages, liaising with their different friends, smuggling in weapons, doing these things. The Palestinian leadership did not have access to this. It simply did not happen. And when foreign fighters like Fawzi al-Qawaqji, like Sa'id al-As, did come into Palestine, they did not find any indigenous officers to work with. They didn't find anyone to cooperate with. They found peasants who had no military experience and urban notables who wanted to write petitions. The urban notables were not incompetent. They were not. The urban notables were supremely competent in all of the wrong things. And that's a very different thing from incompetence. That's why they were able to perform so well in the Ottoman era, but performed so poorly as national leaders. Because the game had changed in such a way that the tools that they had at their disposal just didn't work anymore. They were playing chess while everyone else was playing rugby. Michael Provence told me something that, I don't even know if he realized it, but it gave me goosebumps just thinking about it. He said, Musa Kadhim al-Husseini, he was the former mayor of Jerusalem, became the head of the Muslim Christian Association. He was the father of Abdul Qadir al-Husseini, who died in 1948. He said, it was in response to a question. I asked him, what do you think is the significance of the fact that this was the last generation that had faced off against the European powers as equals? Because in World War I, it was one empire against another. It was a weaker empire, but it was an empire. They did not go in as a subject population. And he said, Musa Kadhim al-Husseini petition the British for way longer than it was appropriate. But in a way, that was rooted in his sense of equality. He could not bring himself to believe that he was not on equal footing with the British, and even worse, not on equal footing with the Zionists. The military graduates, they knew better. They knew that they were not on equal footing because they were born as scum and had to fight for their position. They were not born as notables. They had to reach for it. This is not an attempt at counterfactualism. This is not my way of saying that if only Palestine had had military graduates, everything would have been different and there's an alternate universe where, no. The conspiracy against us was enormous. By 1938, the British had more troops in Palestine than they did in all of British-ruled India. The level of destruction was enormous, and their commitment to the Zionist project was fanatical. Maybe things would not have played out differently at all. What this whole experience was an effort to preserve our story. The problem that we face as, not just as Palestinians, but as advocates, as activists, as people who desire to see a liberated Palestine, is that too much of our identity is wrapped up in our relationship to the Zionist project and our response to the Zionist project. And my every effort in this platform, as well as my podcast, is to explore a dimension of Palestinian identity and the Palestinian experience that is not relevant to the Zionist project. And what I hope this revealed is that were the Zionist project to not have existed at all, we would have had unique challenges that were specific to our historic moment. And we need to do more. We need to explore Palestinian identity in a way that is separate from the Zionist project more frequently and with more intensity. And if we care at all about the subject of anti-colonial education, then we need to recognize that the most important truth and reconciliation is the one that happens between us. We need to be able to look at our own past and forgive each other and forgive ourselves for our shortcomings. So I, for one, move to exonerate the Palestinian notables. They tried their best. Thank you. So thank you for listening, and I hope this met your expectations. I was having a quick conversation with Adil over our break, and one of the things that came up, one of the things that came up was the importance of this medium. Why something like a podcast needs to exist, and why this medium is important. I'll articulate this in a very quick story. I gave a presentation virtually at York University. And the professor, Randall Schnur, is a professor of Jewish studies. He's a sociologist, amazing researcher, a terrific human being, and wanted to bring in a Palestinian voice to share the Palestinian experience. So he said to me, I have a lot of Muslim students. I don't think I've ever had, and his course kind of focuses on the Palestinian experience and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So he says, I don't think I've had any Palestinian students. I don't know if there are many Palestinian students at York University. And my response to him was, did you check the engineering department? Because that's where they are, right? Go to the School of Engineering, go to the School of Medicine, that's where they are. And so for many Palestinians, even highly educated Palestinians, work of history is not always accessible. Most of the Palestinians that I know are doctors and pharmacists and engineers and business owners, and very, very few of us pursued the social sciences. I was very fortunate. My parents did not pressure me to study any. They were just happy that I was studying. Frankly, they were just happy that the police were no longer showing up at our house, telling them about the horrible things that their son was doing. So the fact that I had just gotten my life together was enough for them. But these mediums are important. So if you have the ability to make your knowledge accessible to a greater audience, it is very important to the conversation around liberation. So thank you. Sorry, Sabah. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much, Bassam, for that amazing lecture. So for the Q&A session, we have the CCMS email up. So if you have any questions, feel free to direct them now. We'll give like about 10 to 15 minutes for a Q&A session. So yeah, just feel free to. Oh, it's not up there.
Thank you so much, Bassam. Sorry to be taking the advantage of the existence of the mic. First and foremost, I want to thank you and express my gratitude for the thoughtfulness, the charisma, the excitement that you bring to teaching and instruction. I think we all felt it, and how studious and meticulous you are with history. It means that you approach it with tremendous care. I have a lot of questions, but I'm not gonna belabor you or everybody else. But while the food is getting set up, I'm just gonna ask two questions really quickly. The first is with regards to a comparison of, I know that you've looked at sort of the military academies in other locales and the movement of those who were participants or learned within those academies in those locales. And yet when we look at the outcomes, as you said, towards the end, the counterfactual kind of argument, the outcomes in the sort of anti-colonial struggles in all of those other locales was considerably, fruitless until the end of the Second World War, where we started to see kind of the dawn of the colonial powers in that region, primarily the French and the British. But up until that point, the colonial powers had a fairly firm grip. And I think there is also a fair amount of evidence to indicate that even in places like, Cairo, you ended up having that sort of separation between those two, the military and the civil education. And arguably, it continues to this day. Military education in the region, this is like post-Ottoman, post-Mandate, post-Zionist, I mean, not post-Zionist, but like throughout this whole period, we still continue to see this kind of bifurcation of education between civil and military and what that translates into and what that means. So part of it is a question about, expanding the landscape a little bit more and answering the unanswerable question of, would it have made a difference? And I think you kind of broached it towards the end. The second question is about thinking about and I know you mentioned India towards the end, and I couldn't help but think more about India because, and I want to draw attention to a particular manuscript. This is, by Ranajit Guha, who is, he's now, I think, 99 years old or something along those lines, but he's still alive. He is the precursor to all the post-colonial writers like Said Spivak and Homi Bhabha.
Yeah.
But he wrote an incredible manuscript called The Elementary Aspects of Peasant Insurgency in Colonial India. And he's one of the people that was described as like the originators of the subaltern studies area. And one of the primary questions that he focused his attention on is how the colonial project necessarily created a class of individuals who were notable enough that they felt that they benefited specifically from the colonial project, but at the same time believed that they were adversarial to it. And so they were in that weird state of constant flux, on one end enabling the empire, on the other hand feeling that they represent the collective. And with India being that. So I think you're arriving at a lot of those same conclusions, and he comes off a little bit harder on the notables in India. He basically comes out and says, well, you have your own sort of monarchical system, and the British just allowed you to continue to prevail. But in your case, or in the case of Palestine, it's definitely much more complicated because you've got a Zionist insurgency as well, enabled by the British. There's so many other particularities. But I'm curious to ask you if you are interested in thinking about the colonial project and how it enabled or created the circumstances for the notables to be what they are. I think you've spent a remarkable amount of time on the Ottomans, but my big query is about the British Mandate and what they did. Thank you.
Okay. Wow. Okay. So I will answer the first question as best as I can, and then I may ask you to slightly reword the second question to just make sure I haven't lost track. So I've considered this. The fact is that between 1925 and 1927, the Syrians fought a massive uprising against the French. The French had the notable distinction of being the first European power to pummel by air a Middle Eastern city. So there's that. And the outcome, like you said, was devastation. Let me push back a little bit. So in Iraq, the military officers were significantly more successful in achieving not just autonomy, but sidelining the British and outmaneuvering the British and outmaneuvering Faisal. So if we are looking at the big picture, Iraq needs to be put as an exception. The greatest exception, of course, is Mustafa Kemal Turki, but let's leave that out because we're looking at the Arab Mashriq. In the case of Syria, yes, they failed in overthrowing the French, but they were successful in bridging the urban-rural divide. So this is not just a question of did we rid ourselves of our colonial masters, but were we able to unite each other? And in that sense, no, their accomplishment was massive. When Fawzi al-Qawaqji emerged in Hama, a city where he was not from, and he managed to bring together the ulama, the Islamic scholars of Hama, some of the civil academy graduates, Druze and Bedouin warriors, and the entire urban lower class of Hama all behind him, that's something. That's not nothing. Right? That's huge. And that's something that never happened in Palestine. Even mythologized rebels like Abdul Qadir al-Husseini could not bring himself to be subservient to a peasant revolt. He could not stomach it. And so this was something that, yes, although I agree with you that the outcome would not necessarily have been any different. I do have to say though, the outcome would not have been different, but there is nothing more Palestinian than standing in the face of a raging inferno with like thousands of fiery tongues devouring everything around you and just spitting right in the middle of it in the hope of not extinguishing it, but just saying, at least I did that. So they would have been able to spit that much more. Maybe they would have, in the case where the Syrian revolt fought against the French casualties were much higher than British casualties against the Palestinians. With regard to the second part of the question, which is revisiting the notables as a comprador class or as genuine patriots, the reality is there were too many exceptions. So there were Palestinian notables who were in the service of the British and the Zionists. And these are not really the notables who I'm speaking about. I do not believe that Musa Kadhim al-Husseini was a stooge. I don't. I don't believe that everyone who sold land to the Zionists did not reflect on their Palestinian identity or wanted to see the Zionist project flourish or anything of that sort. In some cases, they just, look, I'll articulate this in another way. Something like 20 years ago, my parents bought a house in Langley, in Willoughby. Does anyone here live in Willoughby? So Willoughby is a massive construction site, basically. It's 40 blocks of townhouses now, but when they lived there, it was 2.5 acres. Well, land developers came and knocked on my dad's door, and he said, not for sale, not for sale, not for sale, until the price was good enough, and we said, okay, fine, I'll sell it. Khalas, like, this is, what more can I do? If a national project were to emerge in the Fraser Valley, they would write about people like my father as a collaborator, right? With whatever, the greedy developers. But that's not how we saw it in real time. It's just not how we experienced it. The urban notables who I've exonerated, who I choose to forgive, are urban notables who tried, but just didn't have the right tools. So while we have people like Raghib al-Nashashibi, Fakhri Abdul Hadi, who outright worked with the British against the rebellion, firing bullets at the rebels, you had people like Akram Zuaytar, like Izzat Darwaza, like Aouni Abdul Hadi. You had a huge cadre of notables who were trying to resist the British in the way that they understood resistance. Because again, they just did not have the tools to fight in any other way. They had never seen it before. Even the peasants who would have had the means to fight were disarmed 100 years ago, up to this point. There's a lot written about the notables as puppets. And what I hope to have contributed to the conversation is another layer that empathizes with them in a way that I don't usually find in the material. Great questions, though. You set the standard very high. Yes, and maybe Sabah, if you could, way at the back. Sorry, an online question? Okay, perfect.
Thank you for the lecture. But I have to say, I don't like the way we talk about notables and peasants, because the outcome is what's happening today. I feel like when you put in your, one of your slides, the divide and conquer, that's exactly what the British wanted us to do within the Palestinian population. I don't feel, because the nobles and the peasants were both working together. Yes, you might have a few people that were, under subject with British mandates or whatever, but most of the Palestinians were united. We were not divided as, I just don't want people to come out like from today, from the lecture, to think that notables in Palestine gave up or sold their land. I feel like that's not fully true, because we have to understand that Palestinians were under Ottoman rule for a long time, and they just wanted the Palestinians not to be powerful, not to stand up for their rights and for themselves. And then we had the British. So the British were taxing Palestinian notables to the point where they couldn't afford their land to keep, just like what's happening right now. So I feel like, I just don't want people to think there was such a divide between, sorry, I'm so passionate about this because I'm Palestinian and my family were from Haifa and Jaffa. So we're going through these struggles until today. So I just don't want people to think that there was such a divide between the two communities, basically. So, yeah. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you again for your lecture, but I just have, for future lectures, just to be mindful of that little point or distinction, because we were not, I don't want people to think that we sold our land, because we did not. So, yeah, thank you.
So there's a few things there. And I am also incidentally from Jaffa. And my grandparents, my grandfather, was definitely from the Effendiyya of Jaffa. Actually, my great-grandfathers were among the largest orange merchants to Europe, and my father's maternal grandfather was the owner of the first bus company that ran buses from Jaffa to Gaza. And my mother is from the most Fallahi stock, that they are Fallahi through and through. Listen, there is a Palestinian mythology that many of us are plugged into, and that is very real and important. There is a history that I do my best to try to sift through. The rift between the urban notables and the peasants was enormous. It was huge. And as a national movement emerged, there were efforts, of course, to mend that rift. The reality is that in many cases, they just had very different experiences in life. One of the other things that I didn't go into too much detail on was actually some of the Ottoman administrative policies didn't help the situation, but the rift is real. But that's why it's called truth and reconciliation. When I describe these divisions, it's not my way of using fallah as a pejorative, like using a peasant as a way of saying that they were somehow lesser than, or talking about the notables as that they are a comprador class. In fact, I've tried to work to overcome this. What I'm trying to do is share a story that may not have been amplified as well as I feel that it should have, but then also move toward healing the divides that we do have. I have friends who live in Palestine now, and these divides still exist. We haven't fully overcome them. The Nakba was a great leveler of Palestinian society. Has anyone here seen At-Taghrib al-Falastiniya? It's an Arabic language show. So I've never watched it. But in my household, like growing up, my mom would always mock this one character. Like just anytime something would happen, certain occasions would happen around the house, my mom would say, "Ana Abu Ayed, ana wajh al-balad." Abu Ayed was a character who was a mukhtar. He was like a notable in a city, and he was reduced to a refugee. So he was going around the refugee camp telling people, "I'm Abu Ayed, I'm the face of this city." And people would say, "Abu Ayed, look where you are. The city's gone." It was in the Nakba that suddenly peasants and urban notables and Bedouins, Christians and Muslims, and from wherever town they were from, were suddenly all leveled into nothing. But prior to that, I will have to respectfully disagree that the rift was enormous. It was massive. I've gotten a 5-minute warning, but I also know that there is an email question.
Yes, there's one last question for today. So are the descendants of the Palestinian notables still relevant today in Palestine-Israel struggle? Or is the current rebellion solely a product of the peasant class?
Oh, wonder. So now, in light of that, I am going to read to you one of the quotes that I skipped over from one of Rashid Khalidi's books, speaking about the Palestinian leadership immediately after the Nakba. So he says, I had deleted the quote and put in another one. No, this is so basically what he says is this. He says, after 1948, the Husseinis, the Khalidis, the Nashashibis, the Tuqans, the Nimirs, the Amadis, all of them were erased from the Palestinian political scene because the Palestinian collective had essentially held them personally responsible for either losing Palestine or selling it. Palestinian history has not been kind to the Palestinian notables. And so the leadership class that emerged after 1948, and definitely after 1967, was all made up of young revolutionaries from what would have been considered in 48 Palestine to be insignificant families. People like George Habash, Yasser Arafat, Abu Jihad, like they were all from very, very simple families. The notables were erased from the Palestinian national movement, essentially.
I think we're good for today. Thank you so much, Bassam. Oh, yeah, sorry, we're out of time.
Danica did have a question. If we don't have time, I can take your question after.
Thank you so much, Bassam. Okay, so before we end off for today, I just want to thank the following sponsors and collaborators for today's event: SFU School for International Studies, SFU Institute for the Humanities, the Caucus, MENA Film Festival, Toronto Palestine Film Festival, Simon Fraser Student Society, SFU Students for Justice in Palestine, Independent Jewish Voices, and the West Coast Coalition Against Racism. And today's food has been sponsored by Tamam. They gave quite a bit of food. So yeah, you guys are free. Feel free to grab some more food. And Adil, do you have any last remarks? Okay, actually, sorry, 2 seconds. Yeah, yeah.
tomorrow and the day after.
Yeah, no problem.
Do you want to do it?
No, go ahead. I forgot about it. No.
I forgot about it too. Okay, folks. In 1 second, you can go and grab some food. I just wanted to remind you that part of the program for Palestine at SFU continues at SFU. But thank you for KPU for hosting us and giving us a home for today, because SFU Surrey did not accommodate us. So this is what happens. We've been uprooted from our campus. But the program continues tomorrow in Burnaby, where we will have a celebration of student-led activism on Palestine. Some of you may not know this, but SFU's student society was able to pass a BDS resolution unanimously within the student council, which is mind-blowing. So tomorrow will be an opportunity for us to celebrate that incredible feat. And to see how they can build on that moving forward. And there will be folks from UBC and elsewhere. So it's going to be an amazing time and a real celebration. We will have remarks coming in from Palestinian American journalist Ahmed Shahabuddin, who works for Al Jazeera. He's going to be either zooming in or sending us remarks, but he'll be involved in tomorrow's program. And we'll have film screenings, Palestinian films made by Palestinian filmmakers. And we will have remarks from them as well. And then on Friday, we will be in downtown Vancouver at Harbour Center. Sorry, not at Harbour Center, but at Woodward's. And we will have an amazing program then as well. Film screenings. For those of you who don't know, Tamam, the Palestinian restaurant that is serving us food today, they are an amazing institution. They really are emblematic of what it means to be living within a Palestinian society. Their kitchen is accommodating. People from all walks of life are there. They are emblematic of all that is great about Palestine. And their food is also precisely that. But they will be sponsoring our food tomorrow. And Subhi, who is the owner or co-owner, or him and his partner are the owners of Tamam. He's a Palestinian filmmaker, and he will be speaking on Friday after screening one of his films. And we will have two speakers as well chiming in. One of them is called Dina Takruri. She works for AJ+. She produces a lot of videos on Palestine, and she's the author of a new book coming out on Ahad Tamimi, the Palestinian protester who did the incredible feat of slapping an Israeli soldier and turned her into a global celebrity. But she talks about what it means to be uprooted, what it means to struggle ever since you were born into this world. And then we will also have Shireen Tadros, who is a prominent former Al Jazeera journalist and the head of communication at Amnesty International. She will talk about the film that she made about the Gaza war, what the Israelis called Caste Lead, and a remarkable award-winning film, and also the report that she authored on apartheid in Israel. So we'll have all those folks involved in the next couple of days. Please join us, but for now, enjoy your meal.